This is the story of Ted Bundy, a man who lured dozens of young women to their deaths while fooling the world with his clean-cut image. From courtroom theatrics to chilling confessions, his case still haunts investigators and criminologists to this day. You have probably heard of him. The charming law student and boyfriend was anything but what he seemed. But where did his chilling descent into infamy begin? Please like and subscribe. Also comment down below what time it is wherever you are. Let's get to it. The story of Ted Bundy's childhood begins with a life constructed on a foundation of secrecy. Born on November 24th, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont, he entered a world where societal norms surrounding illegitimacy heavily shaped the decisions made by those closest to him. His mother, Eleanor Louise Cowell, was a single, unwed 22-year-old woman at the time of his birth, an aspect of her life that carried a significant stigma in the 1940s. In response to these societal pressures and the shame tied to such circumstances, her parents took on an unconventional role. They raised Ted as their own son, while Louise was introduced to him as his older sister. This deceptive family dynamic set the stage for psychological complexity long before Bundy's behavior darkened into something far more sinister. Ted spent his early years under the roof of his grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell. On the surface, it appeared to be a standard, if not slightly old-fashioned, family structure. Samuel, a man described by some family members as short-tempered and opinionated, was the household patriarch. Ted, oblivious to the truth of his parentage, adhered to the belief that Samuel was his father and Eleanor his mother. Meanwhile, Louise played the part of the obedient older sibling, blending into the background of family life. Yet, this setup was more than just a protective arrangement. It was the first in a series of lies that would characterize Bundy's early life. In 1950, Louise decided to leave the Cowell household, taking Ted with her to Tacoma, Washington. There, she began anew with her son, now being raised as her child rather than her sibling. She eventually met and married Johnny Bundy, a hospital cook who adopted Ted and gave him his last name. But even in this fresh start, the shadows of those early lies loomed large. Ted reportedly struggled to bond with his stepfather, who he viewed with disdain, considering him unambitious and unremarkable. Johnny's attempts to parent Ted, including involving him in camping trips and other family activities, were often met with cold indifference. This growing emotional distance between Ted and his stepfather perhaps signaled the beginning of his complex relationship with authority figures, characterized by both resentment and a desire to manipulate. Bundy's early family life, though hidden behind layers of secrecy, was further complicated by the eventual discovery of the truth. In 1969, while rummaging through old paperwork, a then 23-year-old Bundy stumbled upon his birth certificate. Written clearly on the document, in a truth stripped bare of the illusion he'd lived under, was the detail that Louise Cowell was not his sister, but his mother. The father's name was absent, an omission that raised more questions than answers. Who was he? Why had he been left out of the narrative? Most importantly, why had Ted been lied to about the most fundamental aspects of his identity for so long? These questions, likely swirling in Bundy's mind, marked a psychological breaking point for a man whose perception of control and reality had just been shattered. The revelation didn't just pull the rug out from under Ted's understanding of himself. It fundamentally altered his relationship with Louise. While some reports suggest that their bond grew colder afterward, others claim he confronted his mother for answers, though her responses were reportedly vague and unsatisfying. It is impossible to know the full depth of the damage caused by this discovery, but it is clear that the weight of decades-old lies affected Ted in lasting ways. He likely questioned not only his relationship with Louise but also the broader dynamics of trust in his life. Did his grandparents hold the same level of blame? Were they protecting him or protecting themselves? These unanswered questions likely compounded the sense of isolation and resentment that had begun to take root in Bundy's mind. The societal pressures that drove the Cowell family to conceal Ted's true parentage were rooted in the era's views on unwed mothers and illegitimacy. In the 1940s, being born out of wedlock carried a mark of shame, not just for the mother but for the entire family. The Cowells' decision to fabricate a familial structure where Louise was the sister rather than the mother was not uncommon at the time. It was a way of absolving social embarrassment. For Louise, coming to terms with the concealment of the truth while raising her son in a household built on pretense likely created its own emotional burden. But for Ted, discovering the secret at such a formative stage led to an identity crisis that arguably shaped many of his later actions. Adding to the mystery surrounding his origins was the lingering question of his biological father. Several names had been proposed over the years, but no definitive answer emerged. Some reports suggested a man named Lloyd Marshall, while others hinted at a sailor named Jack Worthington. More troubling was the unsubstantiated claim, whispered in corners where family secrets were reluctantly brought to light, that Ted might have been the product of an incestuous relationship involving his grandfather, Samuel Cowell. While this claim has never been proven, the unanswered questions about his paternity left Bundy with a fragmented sense of self, one that fed not only his insecurities but perhaps also his later need for dominance and control over others. Ted's relationship with his grandfather further complicates the narrative. While outwardly portraying himself as a loving and authoritative figure, Samuel Cowell has been described by some who knew him as volatile and abusive. Allegations of him being prone to sudden bursts of violence, as well as engaging in animal cruelty, have painted a troubling image of the man Ted grew up idolizing in his early years. If these accounts hold any truth, they suggest a darker environment in which young Ted may have learned early lessons about aggression and control, concepts he would later exploit in terrifying ways. The impact of the 1969 revelation stretched beyond just the emotional dynamic between Ted and his family. It supplied Ted with his first intimate experience with deception on a personal scale. This exposure to how easily reality could be altered, twisted, or hidden may have contributed to his later ability to fabricate lies with ease and manipulate the people around him. It wasn't simply that Ted learned he had been deceived, it was that he began to see the mechanics of deception as a tool he could wield. Growing up in a household that prioritized appearances over transparency gave him a roadmap for creating his version of the truth, a skill he would later use to devastating effect. Ted's identity crisis didn't happen in a vacuum. Around the time of his discovery, he began to display a duality that would define much of his adult life. Outwardly, he cultivated an image of control, composure, and charm. He dressed sharply, spoke eloquently, and often portrayed himself as ambitious and determined. But under the surface, something far more unsettling was brewing. He was trapping every moment of insecurity, confusion, and resentment beneath a growing facade, bottling it until it would inevitably pour out in destructive ways. The cracks in his psyche, laid bare by the revelation of the truth about his childhood, may have been further widened by his simmering anger at being lied to for so long. This turning point in Ted's life undoubtedly planted the seeds for the person he would become. While it is difficult to draw direct lines between moments in his childhood and his later crimes, it is undeniable that his experience of deception and betrayal during his formative years played a role in shaping the man who would eventually manipulate, deceive, and murder. His ability to mask his true intentions, to present one version of himself while hiding another, can be traced back to a household built on secrets. For Bundy, understanding how easily trust could be broken and how seamlessly lies could be accepted was less of a lesson learned and more of a skill honed. This foundation of lies didn't just define Ted's childhood, it laid the groundwork for how he interacted with the world. The chaotic and fractured emotional landscape of his early years may not fully explain what he did, but it brings context to how he became so adept at pretending to be someone else. This mastery of deceit would serve him well, not in the pursuit of happiness, but in the dark spiral of control, manipulation, and destruction that soon followed. On the surface, Ted Bundy's childhood might seem relatively ordinary, but beneath that facade, there were troubling signs that hinted at the darkness to come. In the early years of his life, Bundy lived with his grandparents, where his grandfather, Samuel Cowell, was a central figure. Samuel was a complicated man, remembered in starkly different ways by those who knew him. While some people described him as a kind and loving patriarch, others painted a much darker picture. Bundy himself, when interviewed in 1987, cast his grandfather in a more sinister light. He described Samuel as a violent, domineering man who imposed his will on those around him. Family members alleged that Samuel was abusive to his wife and even their dog, with some claiming he regularly beat both. This violence was not limited to physical abuse. According to accounts, Samuel also expressed deeply xenophobic and racist views, which added an air of hostility to the home environment. The contradictions in Samuel Cowell's character made the household a confusing place for a child. On the one hand, Samuel was an authoritarian figure who enforced control and discipline. On the other, his temper and erratic behavior created an atmosphere of fear. One bizarre incident, recounted by Bundy's aunt, Julia Cowell, highlights this unstable environment. Julia recalled waking up from a nap once to find herself surrounded by knives taken from the kitchen. Each blade was carefully placed around her bed, and her 3-year-old nephew, Ted, stood nearby, smiling. It could have been dismissed as a mischievous act by a young boy had it not been for the calculated nature of the arrangement or the eerie satisfaction Julia claimed to see in his expression. This single example, though unsettling, became part of a larger pattern of Bundy's behavior that many would later struggle to ignore. Outside of his immediate family, Bundy began to display an alarming tendency for cruelty toward those smaller or more vulnerable than himself. His childhood neighbor, Sandy Holt, remembered him as a child who liked to terrify people and enjoyed asserting power over others. She described him as manipulative and mean-spirited, adding that he had a particular interest in causing pain. One of the most disturbing examples of this was her claim that Bundy had once hung a cat and set it on fire. This behavior, while unconfirmed by other sources, aligns with actions frequently associated with individuals who later develop into violent offenders. Animal cruelty, in particular, is recognized as one of the early warning signs of a developing pattern of aggression and psychopathy, but Bundy's troubling actions did not stop at harming animals. Holt also alleged that Bundy enjoyed terrorizing younger children in the neighborhood. According to her, he would often take groups of kids into the woods, where he would strip them of their clothes and leave them vulnerable and frightened. This was not simple childhood bullying. It was calculated humiliation and control. Bundy even went so far as to build makeshift punji traps, sharpened sticks hidden in pits, which could cause serious harm to anyone unlucky enough to stumble into them. Holt claimed that at least one girl was injured as a result of these traps, highlighting how Bundy's sadistic tendencies were not only present during his childhood, but also escalating in severity. The fact that Bundy's behavioral issues were largely ignored or minimized by those around him is another layer to the story. While neighbors like Holt noticed his cruelty, there does not seem to be much evidence that adults in his life intervened. In part, this may have been due to the fact that Bundy was skilled, even at a young age, at hiding his worst impulses behind a mask of normalcy. He excelled in creating the image of an average, well-behaved boy when it suited him, much as he would later present himself as a charming and confident young man to disguise his true nature. Bundy's ability to compartmentalize, to show one version of himself to neighbors and friends while keeping his darker urges hidden, was a skill he began practicing at an early age. The complexity of Bundy's social interactions as a child and teenager provides further insight into his developing personality. While some classmates from high school later described him as well-liked and socially active, Bundy himself claimed otherwise. In interviews, he stated, "I didn't know what made people want to be friends," suggesting feelings of social isolation or an inability to genuinely connect with others. He also mentioned that he chose to be alone during his adolescence, a statement that contrasts sharply with the image of a popular, outgoing young man. This discrepancy raises questions about whether Bundy's claims of loneliness were genuine or part of his tendency to craft narratives that suited his image at the time. Bundy's troubling behaviors during childhood did not emerge in isolation. They were shaped, in part, by the environment in which he was raised. His relationship with his grandfather was particularly impactful, given the allegations of Samuel Cowell's abusive behavior. Some family members claimed that Samuel had thrown Ted's aunt, Julia, down a flight of stairs, while others recounted witnessing him violently lose his temper with both people and animals. For Ted, living under the authority of such a figure likely provided a distorted model of power and relationships. It is worth noting that Bundy seemed to admire his grandfather at times, describing him as a strong and influential presence. This admiration, juxtaposed with the possibility that Samuel was abusive, adds another layer of complexity to Bundy's psyche. Was he emulating the man he looked up to? Or was he reacting against the fear and control he experienced as a child? The answer may never be fully known, but the influence of Samuel's volatile personality is hard to overlook. Despite the shocking nature of some of Bundy's childhood behaviors, they were easy to dismiss as isolated incidents or part of normal childhood mischief at the time. After all, many children experiment with pushing boundaries, testing authority, and playing rough. What set Bundy apart was not just the severity of his actions but the intent behind them. His acts of cruelty were not impulsive, they were calculated. Whether it was arranging knives around his sleeping aunt, constructing traps in the woods, or tormenting animals, Bundy's actions displayed a desire to exert dominance and instill fear. These tendencies, shaped and reinforced by his environment, were the building blocks of the person he would eventually become. Looking back, it is easy to see these signs as clear indicators of the path Bundy would later take. His need for control, his fascination with pain, and his ability to mask his true self all began to manifest during these formative years. Yet at the time, they were either ignored, dismissed, or misunderstood. Bundy's ability to charm those around him likely played a role in this. Even as he terrorized younger children and tested the boundaries of acceptable behavior, he maintained the appearance of a polite and promising boy to most adults in his life. This duality, of presenting one face to the world while hiding another, was not only a defense mechanism but also a tool he would perfect over time. The warning signs were there from the start, but they went unnoticed by many who knew him. Perhaps this is what makes Bundy's story so unsettling. It forces us to question how often such signs are ignored or misinterpreted. Could something have been done to change the course of his life? Or was the trajectory already set, shaped by a combination of nature, nurture, and the choices he made? These are the questions that linger when looking back at Bundy's early years. As his childhood came to an end, the behaviors that once caused concern would escalate into something far more dangerous. The cruelty and manipulation he practiced as a boy became tools he wielded with precision as an adult, shaping the man who would soon terrify the nation. Those childhood warning signs, once thought insignificant or misunderstood, would eventually mark the beginning of a horrifying pattern, one that no one was prepared to face. And as Bundy grew older, his skill at hiding his true nature would only deepen, making him one of the most dangerous predators of his time. Ted Bundy entered his college years determined to craft an identity that would elevate him above the insecurities and contradictions of his past. At the University of Washington, he projected the image of a confident, ambitious young man ready to succeed. Bundy did not shy away from involving himself in activities that made him appear respectable and socially engaged. He was an honor student, earning the praise of professors and classmates for his intelligence and drive. Beyond academics, he immersed himself in the world of politics, joining Governor Daniel J. Evans's re-election campaign and later securing a position on the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Committee. These achievements were not just about resume building, they were a rehearsed performance of the persona Bundy wanted others to see. On the outside, he was clean-cut, articulate, and driven. Beneath the surface, cracks in that polished image were beginning to show. Few moments in Bundy's early adult life carried as much personal significance and long-term influence as his relationship with Diane Edwards. Diane, a classmate at the University of Washington, was everything Bundy thought he wanted. She came from a wealthy background, was described as elegant and well-educated, and represented to Ted a life he believed was out of reach. Diane became more than a romantic partner. She was an ideal, someone Bundy could aspire to impress and emulate. He later claimed that Diane was the only woman he ever really loved, though their relationship was flawed from the start. Bundy struggled to maintain the polished image that had won her attention initially. While Diane valued ambition and stability, Bundy's lack of direction, shallow accomplishments, and financial struggles became glaring obstacles. By the time their relationship ended, Bundy was left devastated. For a man whose sense of control over how others viewed him was paramount, Diane's rejection dealt a crushing blow to his self-image. Many believe this breakup was pivotal in shaping Bundy's mindset going forward. It underscored the gap between the man he was and the man he pretended to be. Diane's decision to end their relationship seemed to solidify his fear of inadequacy and failure. More importantly, it ignited something darker, a need to reclaim the power he felt he had lost. From this point on, Bundy's interactions with women often carried an undercurrent of control and manipulation. Rather than dealing with the pain of rejection, he channeled it into a growing sense of entitlement. Diane's rejection did not create the impulses that shaped Ted Bundy, but it served as a catalyst for the behaviors he would later act on so destructively. Even as internal frustrations began to mount, Bundy's ability to mask his emotions and appear composed in public only strengthened. Friends and colleagues described him as a natural charmer. He carried himself with an air of self-assurance, though it was often carefully rehearsed. He knew when to flash a smile, when to listen, and when to make himself appear indispensable. Whether working as an assistant to a prominent local politician like Ross Davis, the chairman of the Washington State Republican Party, or volunteering at the Seattle Suicide Hotline Crisis Center, Bundy consistently earned praise for his demeanor. Anne Rule, one of Bundy's co-workers at the Suicide Hotline Center, would later reflect on her time with him, describing him as kind, solicitous, and empathetic. These traits seemed genuine at the time, but they concealed a man who was learning to weaponize those very qualities. College was not just a time for Bundy to gather accolades and connections. It was a period of experimentation, during which he refined the techniques of manipulation and deceit that would come to define him. As psychologist Al Carlisle noted, Bundy's private life took on a distinctly different tone from the person he portrayed in public. He spent time fantasizing, imagining himself as powerful and important, often drawing inspiration from politicians whose speeches he mimicked. Carlyle suggested that Bundy's fantasies extended to his interactions with women, as he began objectifying and dehumanizing them in his mind. Bundy also engaged in voyeuristic behaviors, such as window peeping, which acted as an outlet for his growing obsession with control. These acts were not impulsive. They were calculated steps toward a world where dominance and deception were central. Bundy's ability to transition seamlessly between his public and private personas was astonishing. By day, he was the polished volunteer and aspiring lawyer. By night, he indulged in fantasies of coercion and submission, sharpening his ability to separate his actions from his emotions. This capacity for compartmentalization became one of his most dangerous traits. Those who knew him during these years remarked on his apparent normalcy. Bundy had perfected the art of blending in, of appearing just like everyone else. But for Bundy, being seen as ordinary was not enough. He wanted to be admired, even envied. This desire for recognition further fueled his calculated charm. While his college years were shaped by experimentation and rejection, they were also when Bundy began testing what he could get away with. He recognized the power of first impressions and learned to exploit people's trust in his outward appearance. This was most evident in the professional opportunities he secured despite lacking the credentials or experience to justify them. His work on Governor Evans's campaign and the Crime Prevention Advisory Committee offered him a certain level of public credibility. In these roles, Bundy practiced making himself indispensable, whether by showing enthusiasm, offering ideas, or simply being agreeable in the right moments. His charm was rarely questioned, proving that people were quick to assume the best of someone who fit the mold of success. Despite his growing skill at deception, Bundy's failures left a significant mark on him. Academically, his ambitions wavered. Though he hoped to attend law school, his performance on the LSAT exams was less than stellar, forcing him to confront the fact that his confidence was not always matched by ability. Additionally, the success he portrayed to others often masked deep insecurities about his place in the world. Bundy was acutely aware of the gap between who he wanted to be and who he was. Yet instead of addressing this reality, he used it as a reason to refine his powers of deception further. If people could not see through the facade, that made the facade all the more valuable. Bundy's relationship with Diane Edwards, though long over by the time he achieved these professional and social milestones, continued to influence him. In a calculated move, Bundy rekindled contact with Diane years after their breakup. By that point, he had transformed himself into the polished, ambitious man she had once wanted him to be, or so it seemed. Believing he had succeeded in winning her back, Diane eventually agreed to resume their relationship, but this time, Bundy was in control. Without warning or explanation, he broke things off, leaving Diane confused and hurt. This was not an emotional reunion, it was a demonstration of power. For Bundy, it seemed to be less about love and more about revenge, taking back the control he felt she had stripped from him years earlier. What made Bundy so dangerous was that his charm and intelligence were not limited to personal relationships. As he moved through life, he learned to expand those skills, exploiting them to mask the darkness growing inside him. By the time most people noticed something was wrong, the damage had already been done. His ability to appear normal, to blend in, to convince others of his innocence, was arguably his most lethal weapon. Those early years spent experimenting with deception had turned him into a master of manipulation. It was not just about convincing others that he was harmless, it was about using that trust to his advantage. The transition from shy, insecure boy to charismatic adult was not an overnight change. It was a series of small refinements, adjustments, and experiments. By the end of his college years, Bundy was not just pretending to be someone he was not. He had become a composite of every trait he needed to win people over. He could step into a room and immediately assess how he needed to act to get what he wanted. Whether that meant being charming, considerate, or ambitious, Bundy adapted without hesitation. And while many saw this charm as a sign of confidence, it was ultimately a mask that concealed a man who was preparing to let his darkest impulses take control. Bundy's time at the University of Washington marked the beginning of his double life, where the line between appearance and reality grew thinner by the day. While he continued to refine the skills that would make him both admired and underestimated, his fantasies of power and control were no longer confined to his imagination. The persona he crafted, intelligent, compassionate, driven, hid a simmering rage that would soon reveal itself in ways no one could have anticipated. The question was not if Ted Bundy would act on his impulses, but when. And the answer would soon plunge those around him into a nightmare they could never have prepared for. On January 4th, 1974, everything changed. Ted Bundy crossed the line from fantasies and minor acts of manipulation to violent reality, with an attack so brutal it shocked those tasked with understanding it. Karen Sparks, an 18-year-old University of Washington student, was his first known victim. She lived in a basement apartment near the university campus. That night, she had no reason to suspect she would become part of one of the most infamous criminal cases in history. But as Karen slept, Bundy broke into her apartment, silently beginning what would become a horrific, years-long pattern of violence. Bundy had no specific connection to Karen. She wasn't someone he knew personally, nor was she targeted for any reason other than being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This randomness would later become a hallmark of his crimes. Once inside the apartment, Bundy's actions were methodical and deliberate. He attacked Karen with a metal rod from her own bed frame, using it to beat her unconscious. The assault was prolonged and merciless. The same rod was then used to sexually assault her, resulting in devastating internal injuries, including a ruptured bladder. Karen was left for dead. Bundy didn't know her, possibly didn't care that she was still alive when he quietly slipped out of the apartment, leaving behind a gruesome scene that would plague investigators. Miraculously, Karen survived the attack, but her injuries were life-altering. When she was discovered, she was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked tirelessly to save her life. She remained in a coma for 10 days, and when she finally woke, the damage to her body and mind was irreversible. She experienced permanent brain damage that affected her vision, hearing, and memory. To this day, Karen reportedly remembers nothing of the attack, a small mercy in what was otherwise an unthinkable ordeal. The attack on Karen Sparks wasn't just an isolated act of violence. It was the starting point of Ted Bundy's violent spree. For investigators at the time, it presented a terrifying puzzle. The brutality of the attack suggested that the perpetrator was both deeply disturbed and highly dangerous. Yet Bundy left behind no witnesses and no incriminating evidence that could lead authorities to him. The lack of clues meant police were working with little more than the horrifying results of his actions. They didn't know this case was the beginning of something far larger, and Bundy's ability to evade detection during this initial assault would only embolden him in the months and years to come. One of the chilling aspects of this attack was how Bundy's method hinted at what was to come. Breaking into Karen's apartment demonstrated an alarming level of premeditation and stealth. Once inside, he didn't hesitate to use extreme violence to incapacitate her. His choice to use a weapon of opportunity, the broken bed frame, showcased not only his willingness to improvise but also a lack of hesitation when it came to using whatever he could find to dominate his victim. In many ways, this attack established the template for how Bundy would continue to target women, through calculated force, overwhelming brutality, and a detachment that allowed him to carry out unimaginable acts. Although Karen Sparks survived, her trauma left behind more than physical scars. Her account would have been invaluable to investigators, but her memory of the incident was gone, leaving detectives reliant solely on circumstantial evidence. Bundy's ability to strike without leaving behind meaningful leads made him almost invisible to law enforcement. This invisibility became part of his power. He could operate in plain sight, confident that the absence of evidence would keep his identity hidden, and for a time it did. The assault on Karen went unsolved, a case file that haunted investigators but yielded no answers. This first attack also offers insight into Bundy's psychological state at the time. By January 1974, Bundy had experienced significant shifts in his personal life. Months earlier, he had abruptly ended his relationship with Diane Edwards, leaving her confused and heartbroken. Their reunion, though initiated by Bundy, had been a means for him to reclaim control and power over her after their initial breakup, a pattern that mirrored his approach to many of his interpersonal relationships. In hindsight, this timing raises questions about whether the attack on Karen Sparks was tied to Bundy's unresolved anger and need to exert control. While there is no direct evidence to conclude the connection, the proximity of these events in Bundy's life reflects how his inability to cope with rejection and loss may have fueled his escalating need for dominance. The Karen Sparks case forced investigators to wrestle with the unpredictability of the person responsible. Crimes like these, random and vicious, are among the hardest to solve. Without a personal connection between victim and attacker, the chances of identifying the perpetrator decrease significantly. Bundy relied on this anonymity, choosing victims who had no reason to suspect him or recognize him. This, combined with his carefully cultivated appearance of normalcy, made him nearly impossible to track during the early stages of his crime spree. For Bundy, this first recorded act of violence marked a turning point. Crossing the threshold into physical violence was, perhaps, easier than he had imagined. The attack on Karen Sparks wasn't a culmination of his fantasies, it was the beginning of their realization. And because it went unsolved, there was little to stop him from continuing. Bundy understood that his ability to blend into society would be his greatest defense. While Karen's survival might have given investigators a unique opportunity to stop him early, the lack of immediate evidence allowed Bundy to remain unseen and unchallenged. The Karen Sparks attack also reveals Bundy's skill in escalation. Unlike many violent offenders, who may act impulsively or leave behind patterns that make their capture inevitable, Bundy's approach was both strategic and adaptable. He learned from his crimes, refining his methods with each attack. With Karen Sparks, his methods were brutal but effective. He incapacitated her completely, silencing the one person who could have identified him. And by slipping away unnoticed, he confirmed for himself that his tactics worked. As news of the assault spread across the University of Washington campus, fear and confusion took hold. Female students, many of whom lived in similarly vulnerable situations, such as basement apartments, shared housing with minimal security, or dormitories with open access, were terrified that they could be next. Yet even as local law enforcement investigated the case, the randomness of the attack made it difficult to connect to other known cases. At the time, there were no broader patterns to tie Karen's assault to, and Bundy's unknown status meant he wasn't even a blip on their radar. This attack marked the beginning of a chilling pattern that would grow more sophisticated over time. While Bundy's later crimes revealed his talent for manipulation and his preference for luring victims with fabricated stories of need, such as a fake injury or broken-down car, the Karen Sparks case relied solely on brute force and intrusion. It lacked the calculated charm that would become his signature, showing that, in the beginning, Bundy worked less as the manipulative con artist and more as a predator who relied on surprise and overwhelming force. The fact that investigators were unable to draw meaningful connections between this attack and others that followed isn't surprising. Serial offenders often refine their methods as they progress, making early crimes seem disconnected from later ones in both severity and approach. For Bundy, the Karen Sparks case represented an early experiment, the results of which would inform how he operated going forward. What he learned from that night regarding timing, execution, and the ability to disappear unnoticed made him even more dangerous as his spree continued. Karen Sparks' survival offered a rare moment of hope in a case full of horror, but it also left lingering questions. How had someone been able to do this without leaving a trace? Why had Karen been targeted? And, most terrifyingly, would the person responsible strike again? The unanswered nature of these questions reflected Bundy's growing skill at evading justice. For him, there were no consequences, only the confirmation that his ability to dominate and destroy would go unchecked. In the larger context of Bundy's crimes, the attack on Karen Sparks is often overshadowed by the sheer number and brutality of his later murders. Yet it remains crucial as the moment Bundy transitioned from fantasy to action. It was proof, to himself more than anyone, that he could channel his darkest urges into real-world violence and walk away unseen. For every step Bundy took into the darkness, there was a moment like this, a calculated decision to cross a line and never look back. And while Karen's survival stands as a testament to her resilience, it also underscores the profound cruelty of a man who would stop at nothing to feed his need for control. The assault left a trail of unanswered questions, not just for investigators but for Bundy himself. How far could he go? What was he truly capable of? And, most disturbingly, how long could he keep doing this without getting caught? Just a few weeks later, Ted Bundy would strike again, each attack more confident and calculated than the last. By the time anyone suspected him, the monster he had long kept hidden was already fully unleashed. On a warm Sunday in July 1974, Lake Sammamish State Park was packed with visitors enjoying the summer weather. Families were picnicking, kids were playing in the water, and couples were lounging in the sun. By all accounts, it was an ordinary day in a busy public park. But by the time the sun set, 2 women would vanish without a trace, setting off a frantic investigation and a wave of fear in the quiet suburban community surrounding the lake. For police, the events of July 14th marked an alarming escalation in a series of mysterious disappearances across the region. For Ted Bundy, it was a bold double abduction carried out in broad daylight. one that showed just how confident he had become and how easily he could manipulate those around him. The missing women were Janice Ann Ott, a 23-year-old probation caseworker, and Denise Marie Nasland, a 19-year-old college student. Janice was last seen around midday, sitting on the beach and reading a book. Witnesses later described seeing her talking to a man wearing a white tennis outfit, with his arm in a sling. According to their accounts, the man introduced himself as Ted and explained that he needed help unloading a sailboat from his car. He asked if Janice could assist him, saying he had difficulty managing it because of his injured arm. Witnesses watched as she walked away with him, heading toward the park's parking lot. She was never seen alive again. Denise's disappearance occurred just a few hours later under similar circumstances. She had spent the afternoon at the park with her boyfriend and some friends, relaxing and enjoying the warm weather. At some point, she decided to use the restroom and walked off on her own. Like Janice, she was approached by a man with his arm in a sling, who introduced himself as Ted. He used the same story about needing help with a sailboat to lure her into his car. By the time friends went looking for her, Denise was gone. To onlookers, the interaction seemed harmless at first, just a polite, well-spoken man asking for assistance. But Bundy had planned every detail, exploiting his affable demeanor and fake injury to put people at ease. The disappearances caused an immediate stir. 2 young women had vanished from the same park within hours of each other, an impossibility to ignore. The fact that both abductions happened in a public space, surrounded by crowds of people, made them all the more disturbing. Families who had spent decades feeling safe at Lake Sammamish suddenly began to question the security of their own community. Parents stopped letting their children out of their sight, and young women were told to avoid traveling or spending time alone. The fear was palpable, and it only grew worse as police struggled to find answers. Without the women's bodies, it was impossible to say what had happened, and while early theories ranged from kidnappings to runaway cases, investigators knew deep down that something much darker was unfolding. What made these disappearances particularly significant was the number of witnesses who had seen Bundy that day. Unlike earlier cases where victims seemed to vanish into thin air, the abductions at Lake Sammamish provided a wealth of information. At least 5 different people recalled seeing the man who had introduced himself as Ted. They described him as an attractive young man, likely in his late 20s, with wavy brown hair and a thin but athletic build. He spoke with what some witnesses described as a slight accent, possibly Canadian or British, and appeared friendly, even awkward at times. The witnesses also remembered a tan or bronze-coloured Volkswagen Beetle parked near the area where Bundy had approached the women. These details would later prove critical in identifying the man behind the disappearances, but at the time, they only deepened the mystery. For law enforcement, the Lake Sammamish case marked the first time they began to see a potential pattern. Until this point, disappearances in the Pacific Northwest had been treated as isolated incidents. Women like Linda Ann Healy, Susan Rancourt, and Roberta Parks, all young, attractive, and college-aged, had vanished without explanation over the prior months, leaving behind little evidence. But the Lake Sammamish abductions were different. The witnesses' descriptions, paired with the timing and location of the crimes, suggested that the same person was responsible for both. Investigators worked quickly to create a composite sketch of the suspect, based on details provided by those who had seen him at the park. That sketch, paired with information about the Volkswagen Beetle and the name Ted, was distributed throughout the Seattle area in the hope that someone would come forward with new information. Despite the efforts to piece together a profile of the man responsible, police encountered challenges almost immediately. While the name Ted gave them something to work with, it was also a frustratingly common name. The composite sketch, though detailed, was generic enough that it could apply to thousands of young men in the area. And while the tan Volkswagen Beetle was distinctive, it too was far from rare. Investigators fielded hundreds of tips in the weeks following the disappearances, but many led to dead ends. Bundy's ability to appear completely ordinary, to blend into the background even as he committed horrifying acts, was working to his advantage. He had managed to abduct 2 women in a single day, from a crowded park, without raising suspicion. That confidence would carry into his future crimes, as he continued to push boundaries and test how far he could go. While the investigation continued, the families of Janice Ott and Denise Nasland were left to grapple with the uncertainty of their loved ones' disappearances. Both women had bright futures ahead of them. Janice was a dedicated probation caseworker who had recently moved to Washington for a fresh start. Denise was a college student studying to become a computer programmer, an unusual and ambitious choice for a woman at the time. Their sudden absence left a void in their families' lives, one that would only deepen as days turned into weeks without answers. For the community, their stories became a grim reminder of how quickly life could change. If two women could disappear from a crowded park in broad daylight, no one felt truly safe. 2 months after the disappearances, the search for answers took a grim turn. On September 6, 1974, skeletal remains were discovered off a service road in Issaquah, about 2 miles from Lake Sammamish State Park. The remains were later identified as belonging to Janice Ott and Denise Nasland. Investigators also found other bones at the site, which they believed to belong to an unidentified third victim. The discovery confirmed the community's worst fears. The women hadn't simply vanished. They had been murdered. The location of the remains also provided investigators with valuable insights into the suspect's methods. Bundy had chosen a spot that was remote but still accessible, suggesting that he was familiar with the area and had carefully planned where to dispose of the bodies. The discovery of Janice and Denise's remains marked a significant moment in the Bundy investigation. It provided the first physical evidence linking the disappearances to a broader pattern. Combined with witness descriptions and the composite sketch, it gave law enforcement a clearer picture of the man they were looking for. But even with these clues, Bundy's name remained absent from police radar. At the time, he was simply one of many young men living in the area, unremarkable and invisible to those searching for him. What investigators didn't yet realize was that Bundy's charm and ability to manipulate those around him would allow him to remain one step ahead, even as the evidence against him grew. The Lake Sammamish abductions changed the course of the investigation. They marked the moment when authorities began to take the possibility of a serial offender seriously. The boldness of the crimes, the audacity to target not one but 2 women in a single day, forced police to reconsider the connections between earlier disappearances and the events at the park. It was clear that the person responsible was calculating and confident, someone who knew how to exploit trust and opportunity to achieve his goals. And while the evidence gathered at Lake Sammamish brought investigators closer to identifying the killer, it also highlighted just how dangerous he had become. As the weeks passed, the focus of the investigation shifted to finding the man witnesses had described. The name Ted, the composite sketch, and the Volkswagen Beetle were all key pieces of the puzzle. But Bundy's ability to move unnoticed and change tactics allowed him to avoid detection. Even as police worked tirelessly to track him down, Bundy was already planning his next move. The events of July 14, 1974, were just the beginning of a spree that would terrorize communities across the country. And while the disappearances at Lake Sammamish marked a turning point in the investigation, they also revealed how much further Bundy was willing to go to avoid capture. Ted Bundy's first escape wasn't just bold, it was a chilling reminder of how easily he could outsmart the authorities trying to keep him locked away. By 1975, Bundy's crimes had finally caught up with him when he was arrested in Utah for the kidnapping of Carol DeRonch, a young woman who had narrowly avoided becoming another one of his victims. She had escaped from Bundy's car after he attempted to handcuff her, later identifying him in court as her attacker. This arrest triggered a wave of investigations that began linking Bundy to unsolved murders and disappearances across multiple states. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, and Bundy was soon extradited to Colorado to face charges related to the disappearance and presumed murder of Karen Campbell. Despite his growing notoriety, Bundy had no intention of staying behind bars. The first escape unfolded on June 7, 1977, in Aspen, Colorado, where Bundy had been transported for a preliminary hearing at the Pitkin County Courthouse. Representing himself as his own attorney, he had persuaded the court to grant him special privileges. These included the ability to move freely within the courthouse's law library to review case documents. Since Bundy was acting as his own lawyer, he wasn't handcuffed or shackled. He appeared calm and cooperative, creating no reason for guards to suspect anything out of the ordinary. Bundy used the guise of professionalism to exploit a major vulnerability in the security system. During a recess, Bundy entered the law library with no one to supervise him directly. He opened a second-story window and saw his chance. In a moment that would make national headlines, Bundy leapt from the window, landing on the ground below and injuring his right ankle in the process. Although he was hurt, Bundy's sheer determination drove him to keep moving. He took off into the woods surrounding Aspen, disappearing into the dense terrain while courthouse staff scrambled to react. It was only after 15 minutes that anyone confirmed he was missing, giving him a significant head start. For 6 days, Bundy managed to evade a massive manhunt. Bundy's time on the run after the Aspen escape was spent improvising his survival. He stole clothing, food, and supplies from nearby cabins, all while navigating rugged mountain terrain on foot. Despite the public frenzy and heavy law enforcement presence, Bundy's resourcefulness kept him one step ahead. However, his injured ankle, combined with limited access to necessary resources, eventually slowed him down. On June 13, just days after his dramatic leap to freedom, Bundy was recaptured by local police while wandering through the wilderness, disheveled and exhausted. It was a moment of relief for law enforcement, but Bundy's brief taste of freedom emboldened him. He now knew escape wasn't just possible, it was something he could refine and execute again. Bundy's second escape came just 6 months later, and this time it was far more calculated. After his recapture, he was transported to the Garfield County Jail in Glenwood Springs, Colorado, where he began to meticulously plan his next move. Over the months that followed, Bundy worked on a strategy to exploit the weaknesses in his surroundings. Against the advice of his legal team and friends, Bundy seemed more focused on regaining his freedom than on defending himself against the charges he faced. While awaiting trial, he collected detailed information about the jail's layout, securing a hacksaw blade from other inmates and gaining access to floor plans. The plan Bundy developed was as daring as it was meticulous. First, he began losing weight, dropping 35 pounds to make himself physically smaller. This was necessary because Bundy, using the smuggled hacksaw blade, had been secretly cutting through the steel, reinforcing bars in the ceiling of his cell. Over time, he created an opening just large enough for him to squeeze through. Bundy spent weeks meticulously preparing for the right moment, rehearsing his escape route and gradually widening the opening in his cell ceiling. He was patient, careful, and unusually confident for a man risking everything on such a risky plan. The opportunity finally arrived on December 30, 1977. With much of the jail staff on holiday for Christmas and many non-violent inmates granted temporary furloughs, security was unusually lax. Late that night, Bundy crawled through the hole he had created in his cell ceiling and climbed into the crawl space above. From there, he navigated through the building, eventually breaking into the apartment of the jailer. Once inside, Bundy changed into street clothes taken from the jailer's wardrobe and calmly exited through the front door. The escape was so seamless that it wasn't discovered until more than 17 hours later, giving him yet another significant head start. This time, Bundy had no intention of staying anywhere near Colorado. After stealing a car, he drove straight to Chicago, avoiding detection for days. From there, Bundy began making his way south, eventually settling in Tallahassee, Florida. In his mind, he was starting fresh. Using the alias Chris Hagen, Bundy managed to blend into his new surroundings, renting a room at a boarding house near Florida State University. Initially, he seemed content with laying low and keeping his profile as unremarkable as possible, but it wasn't long before his darker urges resurfaced in devastating ways. On January 15, 1978, just 2 weeks after his escape, Bundy committed one of his most infamous attacks. In the early hours of the morning, he entered the Chi Omega sorority house on Florida State University's campus. Armed with a wooden log, Bundy launched a frenzied assault on the sleeping students inside. In a matter of minutes, he brutally attacked 4 women. Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy were beaten and strangled to death, while 2 others, Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner, were severely injured but survived. Bundy didn't stop there. Hours later, he broke into another apartment a few blocks away, brutally attacking Cheryl Thomas, another university student. These attacks sent shockwaves through the community and the nation, as the brazen violence demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of Bundy's freedom. For law enforcement, Bundy's second escape was a devastating failure. The fact that a dangerous man, already linked to multiple murders, could break out of custody and continue killing underscored significant gaps in the system. Questions arose about how Bundy had managed to secure tools for his escape, why his activities in his cell hadn't been noticed, and how someone with his criminal history was allowed the opportunities to slip through the cracks not just once but twice. The public was furious, and the scale of Bundy's crimes only heightened the scrutiny surrounding these mistakes. Bundy's escapes added a new layer of infamy to his name. His ability to outthink and outmaneuver authorities made him a uniquely terrifying figure. Law enforcement wasn't just trying to catch a killer, they were trying to catch someone who had already proven he could slip away despite their best efforts. Bundy's confidence in his own intelligence, coupled with his willingness to exploit any opportunity, made him even more dangerous while on the run. To the public, his escapes weren't just failures of the justice system. They were proof of how vulnerable even the most secure systems could be. Despite his escape and attempts to blend into society, Bundy's reckoning was inevitable. Law enforcement in Florida quickly connected him to the Chi Omega murders, bringing local, state, and federal agencies together to track him down. Less than a month later, on February 15, 1978, Bundy was stopped by a police officer in Pensacola for driving a stolen vehicle. At first, he refused to give his real name, but fingerprints eventually confirmed his identity. His recapture brought a sense of relief, but also underscored the immense damage caused by his time on the run. Bundy's escapes didn't just extend his reign of terror, they cemented his reputation as one of the most notorious criminals in American history. His ability to deceive, manipulate, and outwit those trying to contain him left a haunting impression on both law enforcement and the public. And while his eventual capture would finally bring him to justice, the ripple effects of these escapes, the lives lost, the questions left unanswered, continued to overshadow the relief of his recapture. But even in custody, Bundy wasn't done shocking the world. The trial that followed would become one of the most highly publicized in United States history, further unraveling the web of lies, manipulation, and violence that defined his life. In the early hours of January 15, 1978, a quiet sense of normalcy lingered over the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University in Tallahassee. It was the start of a new semester, and most of the students were still settling back into their routines after the holiday break. But while the women inside the house slept, unaware of the danger approaching, Ted Bundy was preparing to shatter any sense of safety they had. What unfolded that night became one of the most infamous moments in his deadly spree of violence. Bundy entered the Chi Omega house just after 3 a.m., slipping in through a back door with a broken lock. The sorority house wasn't just a random target, it was an ideal choice for what Bundy had planned. The large house, home to over 30 women, offered multiple potential victims. His preparations and timing demonstrated his experience in remaining unnoticed. Moving silently from room to room, Bundy turned the house into a site of unimaginable horror. Margaret Bowman was the first victim. She was asleep in her bed when Bundy entered her room. With a piece of firewood he had likely picked up nearby, Bundy struck her with such force that she barely had time to register what was happening. Her skull fractured under the blows, and Bundy then strangled her with a nylon stocking he had brought with him. Margaret, young, bright, and full of promise, didn't stand a chance against the calculated brutality Bundy unleashed. Lisa Levy, another student asleep in her room, was Bundy's next target. Her fate was equally horrific. Bundy used the same piece of wood to attack her, leaving severe injuries to her skull and face. Adding to the horror, Bundy sexually assaulted Lisa with a hairspray bottle. She suffered bite marks to her buttocks and other wounds that reflected the rage and cruelty of her attacker. By the time Bundy moved on to the next room, both Margaret and Lisa were already dead. Bundy then entered the shared room of Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner. Unlike the first two victims, the women survived his attack, but were left with severe injuries that would haunt them for years. Bundy struck both women with the same piece of wood he had used before, breaking Karen's jaw and leaving Kathy with deep lacerations to her face. Both women later described waking to flashes of pain and confusion, only to find Bundy standing in the darkness, his weapon raised. Their screams ultimately alerted other house members, sending Bundy fleeing before he could do further harm. What makes the Chi Omega murders even more chilling is the speed with which they occurred. Experts estimate Bundy spent no more than 15 minutes inside the house, despite attacking 4 women. Most of the other residents, startled by the screams, didn't see Bundy or realize what had happened until long after he was gone. He moved with precision, leaving behind a scene that was both shocking in its violence and puzzling in how quietly it had unfolded. But Bundy wasn't finished that night. After leaving Chi Omega, he made his way to Cheryl Thomas's apartment, just a few blocks away. Cheryl, another Florida State University student, had no connection to the sorority. Her apartment provided easy access, and Bundy used that to his advantage. Once inside, he attacked Cheryl with the same viciousness he had displayed at Chi Omega. She survived but suffered severe head injuries that left her with permanent hearing loss and balance issues. The rapid succession of these attacks revealed Bundy's growing recklessness, as well as his ability to blend into the community even after committing such heinous acts. As news of the murders spread, the community was gripped by fear. Parents called their daughters at college, urging them to lock doors and avoid walking alone at night. What had once been a safe campus now felt like a hunting ground. The Chi Omega house, a place of celebration and camaraderie, became the focus of intense media attention and law enforcement surveillance. Reporters and camera crews gathered outside, conveying the terror that had unfolded there to a shocked nation. The investigation into the murders began almost immediately. Law enforcement officials from the Tallahassee Police Department and surrounding jurisdictions arrived at the scene to piece together what had happened. The crime scene itself presented both challenges and opportunities. Despite Bundy's care to avoid screaming witnesses, he had left behind clues that would ultimately work against him. The bite mark on Lisa Levy's body became a focal point. Bite mark evidence was a newer addition to forensic science, and specialists like Dr. Richard Severin and Dr. Lowell Levine were called in to analyze the injury. Using casts of Bundy's teeth, they matched his distinctive dental pattern to the bite marks on Lisa's body, providing solid physical evidence linking Bundy directly to the attacks. This piece of evidence was groundbreaking. At a time when DNA technology didn't yet exist, physical evidence like bite marks could make or break a case. Bundy's distinctive teeth, described as crooked or chipped in places, provided a near-perfect match to the injuries on Lisa Levy. Dr. Levine later described the analysis as conclusive, stating that the likelihood of the bite marks belonging to anyone else was slim to none. This evidence was captured in photographs taken at the scene and presented to the jury during Bundy's trial, making it one of the key turning points in securing his conviction. The Chi Omega murders also signaled a shift in media coverage of Bundy's crimes. By this point, Bundy had already been linked to disappearances and murders in the Pacific Northwest, Utah, and Colorado. But the brutal nature of the attacks at Florida State, combined with Bundy's increasingly cocky demeanor, intrigued and horrified the public. As details of the crime emerged, reporters began connecting Bundy's actions in Florida to his earlier pattern of violence. His ability to evade capture and continue committing these crimes underscored the challenges law enforcement faced in tracking him down. But even Ted Bundy couldn't escape forever. In February 1978, just 1 month after the Chi Omega murders, Bundy was arrested in Pensacola, Florida, following a routine traffic stop. Police discovered that Bundy was driving a stolen vehicle, and further investigation revealed his true identity. After weeks of living under an assumed name, Bundy was finally back in custody. The case against him for the Chi Omega murders began to solidify, with the bite mark evidence playing a pivotal role. When Bundy's trial began, it became an immediate spectacle. Held in Miami due to concerns about finding an impartial jury, it was the first nationally televised trial in United States history. Cameras captured Bundy's every move, from his self-representation as his own attorney to his bizarre outbursts and relaxed behavior in the courtroom. Bundy appeared to relish the attention, often smiling or joking in front of the cameras. For many, it was hard to reconcile the personable man seen on television with the savage killer described by witnesses and investigators. Despite Bundy's attempts to charm the jury and undermine the prosecution, the evidence presented against him was overwhelming. The bite mark analysis, paired with testimony from crime scene experts and surviving victims like Kathy Kleiner and Karen Chandler, painted a vivid picture of Bundy's guilt. Bundy's defense, which relied heavily on undermining the reliability of forensic evidence, failed to sway the jury. On July 24, 1979, Bundy was convicted of the murders of Lisa Levy and Margaret Bowman and the assaults on Karen Chandler and Kathy Kleiner. He was sentenced to death by electrocution, a sentence that many hoped would finally bring an end to his reign of terror. The Chi Omega murders played a vital role in Bundy's eventual downfall. They highlighted his escalating violence, his overconfidence in his ability to evade capture, and the strength of modern forensic evidence. For the survivors and victims' families, the conviction offered some sense of justice, though it could never undo the pain and loss he had caused. And for the nation, the case became a chilling reminder of how Bundy had weaponized his charm and intellect to hide his true nature. Still, even after his sentencing, Bundy's name and notoriety continued to grow. His trial may have reached its conclusion, but the attention surrounding him was far from over and, as the public soon learned, Bundy wasn't finished trying to manipulate his way out of accountability. The trial for the Chi Omega murders was unlike anything the United States had seen before. Held in Miami, an unusual choice brought about by concerns over bias in Tallahassee, the case quickly evolved from a legal proceeding into a media spectacle. Over 250 reporters from across the globe converged on the courtroom, their cameras capturing every meaningful glance, every raised objection, and every unsettling outburst. For the first time in US history, the nation could watch a murder trial unfold on live television. What they saw wasn't just the story of a man facing justice, it was a chilling look at Ted Bundy's ability to manipulate both the system and the people around him. Bundy, who was charged with the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, and the brutal assaults on 3 other Florida State University students, approached the courtroom as if it were his stage. Despite having 5 court-appointed attorneys, Bundy took it upon himself to lead his own defense. This decision wasn't born from a lack of resources. Bundy simply wanted control. According to Mike Minerva, one of Bundy's public defenders, it wasn't about a legal strategy. It was about maintaining power. Bundy's choice to represent himself gave him an unprecedented level of freedom during the trial, including opportunities to cross-examine witnesses and directly address the jury. But what began as a legal strategy quickly turned into a theater of Bundy's ego. From the moment Bundy acted as his own lawyer, his behavior in court demanded attention. Standing before the jury, he made every effort to appear calm, intelligent, and in command. Often, he smiled or cracked jokes, as if the enormity of the charges against him didn't register. His charm, which had worked so well in luring victims, now shifted to an audience of reporters and onlookers. But beneath his composure, Bundy's true nature often surfaced. He was known for outbursts and moments of self-righteous indignation, where he lashed out at the system or interrupted court proceedings. At one point, he argued with Judge Edward Cowart, who tried to keep the trial on track despite Bundy's efforts to derail it. These moments only added to the strange, almost surreal atmosphere of the trial. The public's fascination with Bundy created a dynamic rarely seen in criminal cases. While the evidence against him was mounting, the bite mark analysis, witness testimony, and details from previous crimes, it seemed almost incidental to the show unfolding in the courtroom. Many came not to see justice, but to see Bundy, the man who had managed to charm and terrify in equal measure. Some women in the gallery reportedly dressed up for the occasion, drawn by Bundy's reputation as a handsome, intelligent figure. The disconnect between his outward charisma and the brutality of his crimes left many struggling to reconcile the two images. The testimony presented during the trial painted a stark contrast to Bundy's affected calm. Connie Hastings, a Chi Omega sorority member, placed Bundy near the house on the night of the murders. Her firm testimony established his presence at the scene, setting a timeline investigators had worked hard to piece together. Another witness, Nita Neary, recalled seeing Bundy leaving the house carrying the blunt object used in the attacks. These details anchored the prosecution's case, but it was the physical evidence that struck the strongest blow against Bundy's defense. The bite mark left on Lisa Levy's body became an indisputable link between Bundy and the murders. Forensic odontologists, including Dr. Richard Souviron, analyzed the impressions left on her skin and compared them to casts of Bundy's teeth. Bundy's dental patterns, marked by distinct chips and irregularities, provided a near-perfect match. Dr. Souviron explained the correlation with clarity, ensuring the jury understood the precision of the findings. The bite mark evidence wasn't just critical, it was definitive. At a time before DNA testing, it was as close as prosecutors could get to scientific proof of Bundy's involvement. The courtroom responded to the bite mark evidence with a mix of shock and grim realization. Here was something tangible, something that transcended theory and conjecture. Yet Bundy's reaction remained calculated. He continued to maintain his innocence, casting doubt on the validity of forensic techniques and attempting to undermine witnesses' credibility. To some, his persistence seemed less like a genuine attempt to prove his innocence and more like an effort to stay in control of the narrative. The trial also showcased Bundy's unsettling ability to use the legal process as another form of manipulation. By representing himself, he created opportunities not just to argue his case, but to confront those who accused him directly. During cross-examinations, Bundy stood face-to-face with witnesses and survivors. His questions sometimes bordered on aggressive, designed not to reveal information but to unsettle those on the stand. For many, it was a grotesque extension of the control he had exerted over his victims, a way to reassert his power over those who sought to bring him to justice. On July 24, 1979, after deliberating for less than 7 hours, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all major charges. Bundy was convicted of the murders of Margaret Bowman and Lisa Levy, as well as the attempted murders of Kathy Kleiner, Karen Chandler, and Cheryl Thomas. He was also found guilty of 2 counts of burglary. Judge Cowart issued Bundy's first death sentence shortly afterward, stating, "This court has never seen a more egregious, wanton act of physical violence." Bundy's calm demeanor cracked only briefly. Those who watched him closely noted the flash of anger as the sentence was pronounced. Despite the weight of the verdicts, Bundy remained defiant. On February 10, 1980, during sentencing for a separate murder conviction, Bundy reportedly shouted, "Tell the jury they were wrong." His denial continued to the end, a strange and unsettling reflection of his inability or refusal to confront the reality of his actions. These moments only added to the image of Bundy as someone who couldn't stop trying to control the narrative, even when it was blatantly clear his time was running out. The trial wasn't just an important legal proceeding, it was a cultural moment. The combination of live television, Bundy's bizarre courtroom behavior, and the gravity of his crimes captured the attention of millions. For the legal system, it provided critical lessons about how high-profile cases could unfold in the media spotlight. For the public, it exposed the depths of Bundy's depravity and his alarming ability to mask it. The trial cemented Ted Bundy's status as one of the most notorious criminals in history, a man whose name would forever be synonymous with manipulation and violence. But as the trial ended and Bundy faced life under the shadow of a death sentence, new questions arose. Would the justice system ensure Bundy stayed behind bars this time? Would appeal after appeal prolong the outcome? And perhaps most hauntingly, how many more victims were yet to be accounted for in Bundy's long history of violence? These questions remained at the forefront as Bundy's legal battle continued, leaving a nation both relieved and deeply unsettled by what had unfolded. Bundy's trial might have concluded, but his story was far from over. Ted Bundy spent nearly a decade on death row housed at Florida State Prison. For a man who once manipulated his way out of custody, not once but twice, being locked behind high-security walls with the electric chair looming in his future had to feel like the ultimate trap. But even in the shadow of death, Bundy stayed true to his nature, manipulative, calculated, and persistent in his efforts to maintain control over his narrative. He wasn't content to simply wait for execution. Instead, he launched a series of strategies to delay the inevitable, and in doing so gave investigators stunning new insights into his crimes and mindset. Bundy's most well-known tactic was what became widely referred to as Ted's bones for time scheme. Recognizing that the clock was ticking, he began piecing out information about his past murders, offering it to detectives in small, tantalizing increments. He implicated himself in crimes he had long denied, finally confirming his responsibility for the murders of women like Linda Ann Healy, Jorgen Hawkins, and Susan Rancourt. He also confessed to crimes that law enforcement had never connected to him before, including 3 previously unknown victims in Washington and 2 more in Oregon. But these revelations came with conditions. Bundy's strategy wasn't motivated by guilt or a need to bring closure to the victims' families. It was a calculated move to buy more time, offering just enough information to keep his execution delayed. Bundy's tone during these confessions revealed another layer to both his crimes and his personality. When speaking with investigators, including FBI profiler William Hagmaier, Bundy spoke as though he were an observer rather than the perpetrator, often describing his crimes in the third person. In doing so, he seemed to detach himself from the acts of violence, treating them as though they were carried out by someone else entirely. This created a degree of distance and dissociation that allowed Bundy to talk about even the grisliest details without appearing rattled. When Bundy finally opened up to Hagmaier about the motivations behind his crimes, it became clear just how deeply warped his psyche was. Hagmaier later recalled Bundy describing the deep, almost mystical satisfaction he felt from killing, a horrifying glimpse into how Bundy had justified his actions to himself throughout the years. Bundy's admissions didn't stop at confessions to murder. He also revealed the disturbing extent to which he exercised control over his victims even after their deaths. To Hagmaier, Bundy described revisiting the crime scenes where he had left his victims' bodies, sometimes days later. Bundy admitted to engaging in sexual acts with their corpses until the process of decomposition made it impossible. These acts weren't simply about lust or power. They reflected a grim need for ownership and domination, ensuring that even after death his victims still belonged to him. These details not only provided chilling insight into Bundy's warped mind, but also reinforced just how dangerous and calculating he had been. Despite the groundbreaking information Bundy provided, his attempts to use these confessions as leverage fell flat. His strategy might have been effective earlier in his imprisonment, but by the late 1980s, Bundy had run out of sympathy. Law enforcement agencies had grown frustrated with his constant evasion and manipulative tactics, and victim advocates, along with the families of his victims, were adamant that his execution move forward. For many, the piecemeal confessions felt like too little too late, an obvious ploy from a man who had spent his life manipulating everyone around him. Prosecutors and state officials saw through Bundy's plan, and no further delays were granted. Bundy himself seemed to alternate between resigned acceptance and last-ditch desperation. Toward the end, he made a half-hearted attempt to shift blame for his crimes onto societal factors, telling televangelist James Dobson in a final interview that pornography had fueled his violent tendencies. Bundy alleged that his exposure to explicit material during his teenage years had conditioned him to dehumanize women, ultimately driving him to kill. While this claim garnered minor attention, it was largely dismissed by psychologists, law enforcement, and the public as another attempt by Bundy to deflect responsibility. He had blamed everyone else, his upbringing, his family, even the justice system, but had never fully reckoned with the reality that his actions were his own. On January 24, 1989, Ted Bundy's time finally ran out. The night before his scheduled execution, his prison cell became a hub of last-minute activity. Bundy met with his attorneys, spoke briefly with prison chaplains, and even spent time with Hagmaier, one of the few people he seemed to trust. Despite the chaos surrounding him, Bundy's demeanor reportedly remained composed. Though cracks of fear and anxiety occasionally bled through, he knew there would be no reprieve. By dawn, Bundy accepted a final meal of steak, eggs, hash browns, and coffee, though he barely touched it. At 6 a.m., Bundy was led into the execution chamber. Outside the Florida State Prison, an almost surreal scene had developed. Hundreds of spectators had gathered in the pre-dawn hours, many carrying signs or wearing T-shirts that celebrated Bundy's impending execution. Some brought fireworks, igniting them in the cold morning air when the lights inside the prison flickered to signal Bundy's death. The atmosphere resembled more of a carnival than a solemn moment of justice, with chants of "Burn, Bundy, burn" erupting from the crowd. For the families of Bundy's victims, however, the emotional weight of the day was far heavier. While some expressed relief that Bundy's death brought a sense of closure, others admitted that it was bittersweet, as no punishment could ever restore what was taken from them. At precisely 7:16 a.m., Ted Bundy was declared dead, executed by electric chair. His ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location in the Cascade Range of Washington, in accordance with his final wishes. Despite the welcome sense of closure, his execution brought lingering questions about Bundy's true victim count remained. While he had confessed to over 30 murders, many investigators believed the actual number was far higher, with some estimates placing it closer to 100. Bundy himself was cagey about the true scope of his crimes, often giving cryptic or incomplete answers when pressed. This uncertainty has turned Bundy's story into an unresolved chapter in the history of American serial killers, one that continues to haunt those who worked on the case. In the years since Bundy's death, his interviews, confessions, and psychological profiling have provided critical insights into the minds of violent offenders. Through Bundy's willingness, however, manipulative to discuss his crimes in detail, law enforcement and forensic psychology experts gained a deeper understanding of what drives individuals like him. His conversations with Hagmaier, Michaud, and Ainsworth provided rare clarity on how predators justify their actions, how they choose their victims, and how they attempt to blend seamlessly into society. It's this understanding that has shaped new investigative techniques, helping law enforcement identify patterns and stop offenders before they strike again. But while Bundy's case has served as a resource for criminologists, it also leaves behind a troubling legacy. Bundy's ability to hide in plain sight, living what appeared to be a normal life, while committing horrific crimes, continues to serve as a grim reminder that not all monsters look like monsters. The charisma and charm that Bundy used to manipulate his victims have also contributed to the complicated fascination surrounding his case. From books to documentaries to fictional portrayals, Bundy's story has been retold countless times, often clinging to the darkest corners of human curiosity. For some, these narratives represent a pursuit of understanding, a way to grapple with how someone seemingly ordinary could create so much chaos and destruction. For others, they feel like unnecessary attention given to a man who deserved to be forgotten. Regardless of perspective, Ted Bundy's name remains etched in the public consciousness, and the impact of his crimes reverberates through our culture, our courts, and our awareness of the depths of human capability for both good and evil. Decades later, Bundy's reign of terror and his eventual execution stand as warnings of what happens when the truth hides behind a mask. While the man himself is gone, his story forces us to confront uncomfortable realities about trust, deception, and perhaps most painfully, the darkness some people are capable of hiding right in front of us. And for every unsolved case still associated with his name, one question lingers: how many others are still out there waiting for justice?